function of criticism in the present time by Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold, as we all know, was a poet, critic, and one of the most significant writers of the late Victorian age in England. Now, his essay, The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, was initially published in his first collection of writings named Essays in Criticism, which was way back in 1865. Now, in this essay, Arnold states that criticism should be a dissemination of ideas, an unprejudiced and impartial effort to study and spread the best that is known and thought of in the world. So this, according to Arnold, was the importance or the function of criticism. And according to him, the role of a critic is also very important because a critic views an object for what it really is. And the critic brings the best ideas to the masses and creates an atmosphere that fuels the literary genius of the future. So thus, according to Arnold, criticism and the function of criticism and the role of a critic was equally important if art, especially literature, had to flourish in future. Now, he was against Wordsworth's opinion on criticism because Wordsworth, as though he was a literary genius, he did not support criticism much. According to him, he considered criticism as a form of art that would actually that would not have any use in the creative world. There's nothing creative in criticism, so it was worthless. That was what Wordsworth felt. But Arnold wrote about, or he created theories which told the world that criticism was a form of exercising free creativity and that criticism paves the way for creativity. So Arnold had a different view of criticism. He said that, as Wordsworth says, criticism is not worthless. Criticism is actually paves way for creativity. Now, there are certain critical concepts that Arnold speaks about when he discusses the term criticism. Now, in the essay that we are dealing with, the function of criticism, he defines criticism as, very important, I quote, a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought of in the world, and thus to establish a current of fresh and true ideas. So this, according to Arnold, was the function, or maybe the definition of criticism. It's a disinterested endeavor. Now, the word disinterest was applied in the view of Arnold when he refers to an impartial. So that is the meaning of disinterested. It does not mean that the critic is not interested. It actually means that a critic who is impartial to the writer, or impartial to the content, or impartial to the to the art as such, would become a good critic, and his or her criticism would be termed as good criticism. So initially, the qualification of a critic must be that the critic must be disinterested. Yes, and what comes out of the process of criticism is that the best ideas are propagated throughout the world. Now, according to Arnold, a critic needs to be free from two Prejudices. So this is how you become a disinterested critic. So according to Arnold, a critic must be free from two prejudices, as I said before. One is historical and the other is personal. Now, historical prejudice is when the critic resorts to view through the lens of the past and neglects the present in the work. So, a historical prejudice should be taken off from the critic, where the past has been highlighted and the present is neglected from the work. And two, a critique must not have a personal prejudice or a personal liking that would cloud his or her judgment or criticism. So basically, a critic needs to be free from historical and personal prejudice. Arnold also believed that the production of a great literary work, if a great literary work has to happen, there are certain ingredients that has to go into it. One, the power of man. Two, the power of the moment, which means great ideas, climate of great ideas. Now, both these ingredients, when it comes together at the right quantity, great literary work happens. If any one is absent, the work will not become great. So, one, he says that a critique has to be disinterested. Two, a critique should give away to two prejudices which would cloud his or her judgment. And three, a great literary work is a combination of the power of man and the power of the moment. Now he cites certain examples in his work where he takes the example of Goethe and Byron. Now both were, great productive powerhouses. Yet Goethe's work was much more powerful because he had a rich cultural background. The power of the moment was with him. So he also mentions how Shakespeare was not a deep reader, which actually affected his work, but his fame and glory were a result of his age and the climate of great ideas. So it is the power of the man and the power of the moment that makes people great, or that makes a work appear to be a great literary work. So basically, Arnold says, by definition, there are three functions of a critic. Which are the three functions of a critic? By the definition of criticism, which is provided by Arnold, the task of a critic is threefold. So, the first task of a critic, or the first duty of a critic, is to learn, and for that he must see things as they really are. The second task is to hand on this idea to others, to convert the world, to make the best ideas prevail. Third, it requires the critic to create a favorable atmosphere for creative genius of the future. And this can be only done by promoting the current ideas in the highest degree, and thus nourishing creative power. So according to Arnold, these are the three functions of the task of a critic. One, to keep his or her eyes open, which means to observe things keenly. Two, to propagate best ideas. And three, to create an ambience, to create a favorable atmosphere for the flourishing and nourishing of creative power. Thus, without the prevalence of best ideas, there will be a cultural anarchy. So this is a warning that Arnold gives to the society. Without the pruning and without the propagation of best ideas, there will result a cultural anarchy gradually in the society. Further, he indicates that two powers must converge to create a great piece of literature. And that is what we, said before. The power of man and the power of the moment. So, according to Arnold, the quest to be a critic. You know, if you really want to be a critic, you must not hold yourself aback by thinking that this is not a creative process. So he says that also, in order to become a good critic, you should have knowledge, or you should substantially draw from foreign literature too, so that ideas are propagated, irrespective of boundaries or irrespective of languages. So thus, Arnold has a high conception of the vocation of a. According to him, a critic is a necessary part of analyzing literature. He suggests that the role of criticism, or the function of criticism, is a very valuable one. He mirrors, or he borrows, Aristotle's view of poetry, as he explains that the highest function of a humankind is exercising its creative power. Criticism performs another important function as well. So, apart from exercising creative power, it also rouses men out of their self-satisfaction. It shakes the external, artificial ego of a man and makes their mind dwell upon what is excellent, or gives them stuff or content to contemplate on. So that is the second role of criticism. So one is, of course, um, to produce creative power by analyzing a work of art. It also helps the reader to think in different perspectives, which a reader himself or herself would not actually be able to do so. But criticism would help them to see literature from different lenses. Therefore, a critic must rise above the practical considerations and have an ideal perfection as his aim, so that the others who reads his or her criticism rises up to them, increasing the standards of literature. He also, in this essay, provides a defense on the significance of criticism, because this was published in a time when criticism was not that important. Publishing literary art, or publishing an art, or maybe publishing a work, was much more important than a critic analyzing it. So he says that criticism is important, in the society. He argues that a lot of literature from European nations have been used for the purpose of criticism. But he also says that England has failed to produce and encourage a significant amount of critical writing, which according to him is very dangerous, because if critical writing is not encouraged, then the standard of literature can go down, because there's no one to mark, no one to mark a line, or no one to tell you how your writing is. Now, he says that this discouragement of critical writing in England happened due to the attitudes of writers towards criticism. And he takes the example of Wordsworth to illustrate this further. Now, Wordsworth believed that critical writing was a waste of time. It is a waste of time for the author as well as the reader, because both of them are not going to benefit anything from it. That is what Wordsworth felt. He also states that great harm can be done through critical writing, but little harm occurs through means of creative writing. So Wordsworth compares critical writing to creative writing, saying that Critical writing is an absolute waste of time, whereas creative writing at least, provides pleasure for the author and the reader. Now, Arnold defends this by arguing that if a man has talent in one line of writing, he must not be forced to create original writing under the pretext that critical writing is of no value. So this is the argument that Arnold puts forth, that if a man has a little talent, that is only shown in one line of his entire work, he must not be forced to write or to give out original writing just because he's scared of criticism against him. It's almost too much to expect a poor human nature that a man capable of producing some effect in one line of literature should, for the greater good of society, voluntarily doom himself to impotence and obscurity in another. Unquote. So this is the quotation in which he says that criticism is actually very important for the author and the reader. He also goes on to point out the paradox of Wordsworth's belief on criticism, as Wordsworth had indulged himself in being a critic by writing against literary criticism. So, in that sense, if you see, Wordsworth himself is a critic because he is criticizing the importance, or maybe he is criticizing the very genre of literary criticism. So Arnold says, in every walk of life, we are critics. We need criticism, and that is only to be used as a creative. Now, literary criticism and creativity is, or goes hand in hand, is what Arnold feels. He believes that critical capacity is to be more important. Creative capacity is more important than critical faculty. He agrees to that. But he also asserts that the creation of the quality of a work is not possible unless and until criticism is available. So literary criticism and creativity thus goes hand in hand. He also argues that critical writing is an important activity of exercising free creativity. So finally, criticism is necessary because, according to Arnold, creative power works with certain materials. And for authors, these ideas, the best ideas on every matter which literature touches current at the time, however, authors do not discover these ideas, rather they synthesize them into their work of art. So, for an author who takes the best ideas and synthesizes that into his or her work of art, for such an author, the author needs his work to be analyzed by a critic so that these best ideas are taken out from the work and projected in different ways to the audience so that it is easier for the reader to think differently or to think in a higher level. Therefore, the author needs to live in a society where true ideas are discussed and debated. So, discussion and debating of ideas are necessary. It has always been there right from the time man is here on the earth. Debating and discussions are always there, and Arnold feels that that is one way true ideas are propagated around the globe, where true thoughts are cherished, passed on. And the example that he says is like ancient Greek or Renaissance England. So thus he advocates that good criticism propagates good literature. That is his last point. Thus, to conclude, Matthew Arnold is thus called as the first modern critic, or you can also call him as the critic's critic. He tells the critic how to improve their critical process. And the function of criticism at the present time, Arnold makes an effort through this work to demonstrate that criticism in itself has several functions and should be observed as an art in itself. It is as important, it should be kept at a high pedestal, just at par with the original work itself. And thus, Arnold's method for literary criticism was widely accepted, and it went on to actually influence the first 60 years of the 20th century. It was after that that slowly different other criticisms came into being. So the initial 60 years of the 20th century was majorly influenced by Matthew Arnold's defense of criticism and definition of a critic and the role of a critic. So Arnold's idea were a result of the prevalence of cultural anarchy. So this is the purpose. So this is why Arnold felt that such an essay should be written, because there was a sort of cultural anarchy that was happening during the Victorian period in England. And in order to break through that, in order to dismantle that cultural anarchy, he says that this role of a critic, or only a critic, can dismantle this cultural anarchy in the Victorian England. And this leads him to take up the mission to bring about a cultural regeneration in the literary world through the means of objective criticism. Objective criticism, which means criticizing a work of art without any bias, by only looking at the content and analyzing or bringing out the best ideas from the work and then propagating that to the readers. So thus, his critic is a critic of the Victorian life and also the society which prevailed then.